people who died twice in the Bible. Death is often seen as the final chapter, the closing of the book on a person's life. The Bible tells us in Hebrew 9:27 that it is appointed unto every man to die once and afterward judgment. But in the pages of the Bible, there are extraordinary individuals who defied this expectation. Not just once, but twice. These were men, women, and children who crossed the threshold of death, only to be brought back to life by the miraculous power of God. Yet unlike Christ, whose resurrection was eternal, these individuals still carried the weight of mortality. Their stories are scattered across both the Old and New Testaments, each one unique yet bound by a common thread: divine intervention in the face of death. Some were raised by prophets, others by Jesus himself, and one was revived by the lingering power of a holy man's bones. But in the end, they all met death a second time, a reminder that their resurrections were temporary mercies, not permanent escapes. These are the 8 remarkable individuals who lived, died, and lived again, only to die once more. Their lives serve as powerful testimonies of God's power, His compassion, and the promise that one day through Christ, death itself will be defeated forever. Let's delve into these incredible stories, showcasing God's power over death. 1. The resurrection of Lazarus. John 11:144. The sun hung low over the village of Bethany, casting golden light over the dusty streets. In a modest home on the outskirts of town, the air was thick with grief. Mary sat on the floor, her face buried in her hands, her sobs muffled by the fabric of her shawl. Martha, the elder sister, stood by the doorway, wringing her hands anxiously. Their brother, Lazarus, lay still on a cot in the next room, his once strong frame now weak and lifeless. The sickness had taken him swiftly despite their desperate prayers. Send word to Jesus, Martha had urged days earlier. He can heal Lazarus. A messenger had been sent, running across the dry terrain to find the teacher. But days had passed, and there was no sign of Jesus. Then Lazarus took his last breath. Wailing filled the house. Neighbors came, bringing food, speaking words of comfort, yet nothing could ease the sister's pain. Lazarus was dead. His body was wrapped in linen and placed in a tomb, a cave sealed with a heavy stone. The mourning began, lasting 4 days, as was their custom. On the 4th day, someone spotted travelers approaching the village. Word spread quickly. Jesus was coming. Martha wiped her tear-streaked face and rushed out to meet him. As she neared him, she stopped, her chest heaving with emotion. "Lord," she cried, her voice thick with sorrow, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus' gaze was full of compassion. "Your brother will rise again." Martha nodded, though her heart ached. "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus stepped closer, his voice steady and full of power. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live." Do you believe this? Tears welled in Martha's eyes. "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God." She turned and hurried back to the house. "Mary, the teacher is here," she whispered. "He is asking for you." Mary rose at once, her grief momentarily forgotten. She rushed to Jesus, fell at his feet and sobbed, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Seeing her weeping and the crowd of mourners who had followed, Jesus' own heart ached. He looked upon their sorrow, the depth of their pain, and a tear escaped down his cheek. The people murmured in amazement. "See how he loved him," some said. Others whispered, If he could open the eyes of the blind, why couldn't he keep Lazarus from dying? Jesus, deeply moved, straightened. Where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. They led him to the tomb, a cave with a great stone covering its entrance. Take away the stone, Jesus commanded. Martha hesitated. Lord, by now there will be a bad odor. He has been dead 4 days. Jesus turned to her. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Martha swallowed hard and nodded. With a gesture, she signaled to the men nearby, who stepped forward and strained to roll the heavy stone aside. The scent of death wafted into the air, and the mourners covered their noses. Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven. Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I say this for the sake of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. Then, in a voice that rang with divine authority, he called out, Lazarus, come forth. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The silence was deafening. Then, from the dark depths of the tomb, movement. A figure emerged, wrapped from head to foot in burial linens. His face was still covered, his steps slow and stiff, but he was alive. The crowd erupted in cries of shock and wonder. Some fell to their knees, others wept openly. Unbind him, Jesus said, and let him go. Hands trembled as they rushed to remove the grave clothes. And there, beneath the layers of cloth, stood Lazarus, blinking in the sunlight, breathing, alive. Mary and Martha clung to their brother, sobbing in disbelief and joy. The impossible had happened. Death had lost his grip. Many in a crowd believed that day, seeing with their own eyes the power of Jesus over death itself. But others, hearts hardened, hurried away to report to the Pharisees what had taken place. In raising Lazarus, Jesus not only gave him life again, but he foreshadowed his own resurrection. The victory that would soon change the world forever. 2. The resurrection of Jairus' daughter. Mark 5:21-43, Luke 8:40-56. The sun was high over Capernaum, its light reflecting off the Sea of Galilee as waves gently lapped against the shore. A crowd had gathered, pressing in from all sides, eager to see the man who had performed countless miracles, the teacher, the healer, Jesus of Nazareth. Among the crowd was Jairus, a respected ruler of the synagogue. His usual composure was gone, his eyes wild with desperation. He pushed through the throng, ignoring the murmurs of shock from those who recognized him. A man of his standing did not typically seek the help of an itinerant preacher, but Jairus did not care. His daughter, his only child, lay dying. Finally reaching Jesus, Jairus fell at his feet, grasping the hem of his robe. Teacher, my little daughter is dying, he pleaded, his voice shaking. Please, come and lay your hands on her so that she may be healed and live. Jesus looked down at the man, seeing the anguish in his eyes. Without hesitation, he nodded. Let us go. Jairus' heart pounded as they made their way through the crowded streets. But the people swarmed around Jesus, slowing their progress. Every moment was precious. His daughter's life was slipping away. Then suddenly, Jesus stopped. Who touched me? He asked, looking around. Jairus stiffened. Not now. He clenched his fists, willing Jesus to keep moving. His daughter needed him. The disciples were bewildered. Master, the crowd is pressing all around you. How can you ask who touched you? But Jesus turned, his gaze falling upon a trembling woman. She fell to her knees, confessing that she had touched the hem of his garment, believing she would be healed from a bleeding condition that had plagued her for 12 years. and she was. Jesus smiled gently. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jairus barely heard the words. His thoughts were consumed by his daughter. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a familiar voice called out, "Jairus." His heart dropped. A servant from his household stood there, his face dark with sorrow. "Your daughter is dead," the man said softly. "Do not trouble the teacher any further." Jairus staggered back, his vision blurring. Dead? No. He had been so close. If they had just moved faster. Jesus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Only believe." Jairus swallowed, nodding weakly. He had come this far. He had to believe. Jesus turned to the crowd. "No one else may follow?" He beckoned only Peter, James, and John to continue with them. When they arrived at Jairus' house, wailing filled the air. Professional mourners had already begun their ritual, weeping loudly, their cries piercing the afternoon sky. Women tore at their garments, dusting their heads with ashes in sorrow. Jesus stepped forward. "Why are you making such a commotion? The child is not dead but sleeping." The mourners scoffed. They had seen her lifeless body. They knew death when they saw it. But Jesus ignored their laughter and took Jairus, his wife, and his 3 disciples inside the house. The room was dim, the air heavy with grief. Jairus' wife knelt beside the still form of their daughter, her silent sobs shaking her small frame. Jesus approached the bed, his expression calm, filled with divine authority. He reached out and gently took the girl's cold hand. "Talitha cum," he said softly. "Little girl, I say to you, arise." For a moment, there was nothing. Then, her chest rose with a deep breath. Her eyelids fluttered, and she opened her eyes, gazing at Jesus. Then, as if waking from a deep sleep, she sat up. Jairus' wife gasped, covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jairus stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. Jesus smiled and helped the girl to her feet. "Give her something to eat," he said. The stunned parents rushed to embrace their daughter, crying tears of overwhelming joy. She was alive. Meanwhile, the disciples stood in awe. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, even calm the storm. But this was power over death itself. Jesus turned to them. "Tell no one about this," he instructed. But how could they keep such a miracle silent? Outside, the mourners continued their wailing, unaware that inside the house, death had been defeated. Jairus, once desperate and hopeless, now clutched his daughter's warm, living hand. And in that moment, he understood. Jesus was more than just a teacher. He was the giver of life. 3. The resurrection of the widow of Zarephath's son. 1 Kings 17:8-24. The land was dry and cracked, the fields barren under the relentless sun. Famine gripped the land of Zarephath, a small Phoenician town near Sidon. The people struggled, their once thriving community now reduced to despair. At the edge of town, a widow stood, her figure weary and frail. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, her face lined with worry. In her hands, she held a few sticks, her last effort to prepare a final meal for herself and her son. Inside their small home, her young son lay weak on a tattered mat. Hunger had stolen the strength from his body. His breathing was shallow, his eyes sunken. The widow swallowed back her tears. Just as she turned to go inside, a stranger approached. He was a man with a weathered face, his clothes dusty from travel. "Please," he called to her, Bring me a little water in a cup so that I may drink." The widow hesitated but nodded, turning toward her home. As she walked, the man called again, "And bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." She stopped, her heart heavy. Turning back, she said, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and prepare a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and then die." The man stepped closer, his eyes kind but firm. "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a small loaf of bread from what you have and bring it to me. Then make some for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour shall not be used up, and the jug of oil shall not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Something about his voice filled her with hope. Though it seemed impossible, she obeyed. She went inside, mixed the last of her flour and oil, and baked a small loaf. She brought it to the man and then returned to make more for herself and her son. To her astonishment, the flour had not diminished, the oil had not run dry. Each day, she found enough to sustain them. The man, Elijah, a prophet of the Lord, stayed with them, and the widow marveled at how her home, once filled with hunger, now held abundance. Tragedy strikes. But just as hope had begun to take root in her heart, darkness came again. One morning, as she prepared a meal, she heard a weak cough from the other room. Rushing to her son's side, she found him pale, his breath shallow, his body burned with fever, his small hands limp at his sides. "Hold on, my son," she whispered, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. But his condition worsened. The fever consumed him. His breaths became more ragged, until, at last, he exhaled one final time. His body stilled. The widow stared, her hands trembling. "No, no, no!" She shook him, but he did not stir. Tears ran down her face as she clutched his lifeless form. The child who had survived famine, who had lived on miraculous provision, was gone. Grief turned to bitter anger. She turned to Elijah, her voice shaking with fury. "What have you done to me, O man of God? Have you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah's heart ached at her words. He took a deep breath and spoke gently. "Give me your son." The widow hesitated before releasing the boy's still body into his arms. Elijah carried him upstairs to the room where he stayed. He laid the child on his own bed and knelt beside him. The prophet's prayer. Elijah lifted his hands and cried out, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even upon this widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" He stretched himself over the child 3 times, each time pleading, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." The room was silent, except for the prophet's urgent prayers. Then, suddenly, a gasp. The boy's chest rose. His eyelids fluttered open, and color returned to his cheeks. He blinked in confusion. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The Lord had answered. Gently, he lifted the child and carried him downstairs. The widow looked up, her face streaked with tears. When she saw her son, alive, breathing, she clapped her hands over her mouth in shock. Elijah smiled as he placed the boy in her arms. "See, your son lives." The widow stared at her child before turning back to Elijah, her voice filled with awe. "Now, I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." The once hopeless home of the widow was now a place of faith. She had seen the power of God with her own eyes, not only in the miracle of provision, but in the very breath of her son. restored to life. 4. The resurrection of the Shunammite, woman's son. 2 Kings 4:837. The sun hung low over the hills of Shunem, casting a golden glow over the fields. In the heart of the village stood a fine house, one that belonged to a woman of great wealth and generosity. Though she had many blessings, there was one thing she lacked: children. She and her husband were well advanced in years, and though they had accepted their fate, a quiet sorrow lingered in their hearts. One day, a prophet named Elisha passed through their village. The woman, sensing that he was a man of God, invited him into her home for a meal. "Whenever you pass this way," she said kindly, "please stop here and eat." Elisha accepted her hospitality, and over time, he became a frequent guest in their home. Seeing his need for a place to rest, she spoke with her husband. "Let us build a small room on the roof," she suggested. "Furnish it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever the man of God comes by, he may stay here." Her husband agreed, and soon the room was prepared. A long-awaited promise. One day, as Elisha rested in his new quarters, he called for the woman. "You have gone to such trouble for us," he said, looking at her with gratitude. "What can be done for you? Would you like me to speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" The woman shook her head. "I dwell among my own people," she replied. She needed nothing. But Elisha's servant, Gehazi, spoke up. "She has no son, and her husband is old." Elisha's eyes softened. He turned to the woman. "About this time next year, you will hold a son in your arms." The woman's breath caught. She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "No, my lord, O man of God, do not deceive your servant." But the prophet's words were true. Within a year, she bore a son. Her heart overflowed with joy. A child's death and a mother's faith. Years passed, and the boy grew into a bright and lively child. One morning he ran out to the fields where his father and the reapers were harvesting. My head, the boy suddenly cried, clutching his temples in pain. Alarmed, his father called to a servant. "Carry him to his mother." The servant lifted the boy into his arms and hurried back to the house. The mother gathered him into her lap, stroking his hair, whispering words of comfort. But as the hours passed, his breathing became shallower, his body weaker. Then, just before noon, the boy's body stilled. The woman's heart clenched, but she did not weep. Instead, she laid her son on Elisha's bed in the prophet's chamber and shut the door behind her. "Send me a servant and a donkey," she told her husband. "I must go to the man of God at Mount Carmel." Her husband looked at her, puzzled. "Why go today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath." She met his gaze and simply said, "It is well." She mounted the donkey and urged the servant, "Ride fast. Do not slow down unless I tell you." For miles they rode, the wind whipping through her hair, dust rising beneath the donkey's hooves. She had one goal: to reach Elisha, a prophet's intervention. When Elisha saw her approaching from afar, he turned to Gehazi. "Look, there is the Shunammite woman. Run to her and ask, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?'" But she did not stop for Gehazi. She pressed forward until she reached Elisha, then fell at his feet, gripping his robe in desperation. Gehazi moved to push her away, but Elisha stopped him. "Leave her be, for she is deeply distressed, and the Lord has hidden it from me." The woman lifted her tear-streaked face. "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elisha understood at once. He turned to Gehazi. "Take my staff and go quickly. Do not stop to greet anyone. Lay my staff on the child's face." But the mother shook her head. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." Seeing her unwavering faith, Elisha nodded. He rose and followed her. When Gehazi reached the house ahead of them, he laid the staff upon the boy's face. But there was no sound, no movement. The child remained lifeless. Gehazi met them on the road with a solemn face. "The boy has not awakened," he reported. Elisha continued walking without a word. A life restored upon arriving at the house, Elisha entered the upper room and shut the door. He knelt beside the child and prayed earnestly. Then he stretched himself over the boy, his mouth to the child's mouth, his eyes to the child's eyes, his hands to the child's hands. He remained that way until the boy's body grew warm. Elisha got up and paced the room, then stretched himself over the child once more. Suddenly the boy sneezed. Once, twice, 3 times, 7 times. Then his eyes fluttered open. Elisha smiled and called for Gehazi. "Summon the woman." The mother entered the room, her heart pounding. "Take up your son," Elisha said. Tears streamed down her face as she rushed forward and gathered her child into her arms. He was warm, breathing, alive. She fell at Elisha's feet, bowing in gratitude, then lifted her son and carried him downstairs. Once again, death had been conquered. 5. The man revived by Elisha's bones. 2 Kings 13:20-21. The prophet Elisha, the faithful servant of God, has spent his life performing miracles, prophesying to kings, and guiding Israel with wisdom. But as all men do, he eventually fell ill, and his time on earth came to an end. When he died, his body was placed in a tomb, a solemn resting place carved into the rock, where his followers mourned him. Though his voice had been silenced, his legacy remained, and many still whispered about the wonders he performed. Time passed, and the land of Israel found itself once again under threat. Bands of Moabite raiders frequently invaded the territory, striking fear into the hearts of the people. The Israelites were always on guard, watching the hills for the telltale signs of an approaching enemy. A sudden burial. One day, a small group of men carried a lifeless body through the outskirts of a town. A loved one had passed away, and they were on their way to bury him in the customary manner. The mourners walked in quiet reverence, their hearts heavy with grief. As they approached the burial site, a sudden cry rang out. "Moabite raiders!" Panic seized them. From the hills, a band of warriors galloped toward them, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. The Israelites had no time to dig a proper grave, no time for final prayers or farewells. Their only thought was survival. "Quickly, throw him in a tomb," one of the men shouted. In their desperation, they looked around and saw the nearest tomb, a stone chamber, its entrance partially open. Without thinking, they hurriedly carried the body inside and laid it within. Then they fled. A miracle in the tomb. The lifeless body tumbled onto the floor, rolling until it came to rest against something ancient and dry, Elisha's bones. The moment the dead man's body touched the prophet's remains, a surge of power filled the tomb. A breathless silence followed. Then, in an instant, the dead man's chest rose, his fingers twitched, his eyes fluttered open. Life had returned. Gasping, the man sat up, his heart pounding. He looked around the dim tomb, disoriented, his breath ragged. He had been dead, but now he lived. Outside, The Moabite raiders had begun their charge, scattering the mourners. But suddenly, from the very tomb they had abandoned, the man they had just buried stumbled out, alive. Shouts of terror erupted from both the Israelites and the Moabites. Some ran in fear, believing they had witnessed a ghost. Others fell to their knees, awestruck by the undeniable power of God. The man, still trembling, looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers as if trying to understand what had happened. The last thing he remembered was darkness. But now he stood among the living, his heart beating strongly in his chest, a testament to God's power. Though Elisha was long gone, the power of God had not faded. Even in death, the prophet had performed one final miracle, proving that God's power over life and death was absolute. The story spread quickly throughout Israel, a reminder that God was not bound by time or the grave. Even the bones of his prophet carried the authority of heaven. And so, the man who had died once would go on to live again, until the day that death came for him a second time. 6. The resurrection of the widow of Nain's son. Luke 7:11-17. The town of Nain lay nestled at the foot of the hills, a quiet village where people lived simple lives. Its narrow streets bustled with merchants, shepherds, and townsfolk tending to their daily tasks. Yet on this particular day, sorrow hung over the town like a heavy cloud. A widow, frail and weary, walked slowly through the streets. Her eyes were red from weeping, her face hollow with grief. Before her, carried on a wooden bier, lay the lifeless body of her only son. He had been the last joy of her life. She had already lost her husband years ago, and though the pain of widowhood had been unbearable, her son had been her hope, her comfort, her future. Now, he was gone. The once lively home they had shared was now silent, empty. Behind her, a great crowd from the village followed, mourning with her. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had come to pay their respects. The funeral procession moved toward the gates of the city, where the young man's body would be taken outside the walls to be buried. But just as they reached the gate, another crowd was approaching from the opposite direction. A divine encounter. Jesus of Nazareth, the miracle worker and teacher, walked toward Nain, his disciples following close behind. He had been healing the sick, casting out demons, and proclaiming the kingdom of God. People from all over Galilee had begun to follow him, eager to witness his mighty works. As he neared the town gate, he saw the procession. The sight of the weeping widow caught his attention. Jesus stopped. His eyes rested on her, filled with deep compassion. He did not ask who she was or why she grieved. He knew. He saw beyond the tears, beyond the loss, beyond the hopelessness in her heart. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and gently said to her, "Do not weep." The crowd murmured in confusion. How could she not weep? She had lost everything. But before anyone could respond, Jesus moved toward the bier where the young man lay. The pallbearers, startled by his approach, stopped in their tracks. Then, Jesus did something unthinkable. He reached out and touched the bier. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Touching a dead body, or even what carried it, would make a person ceremonially unclean. But Jesus did not hesitate. His touch was different. With a voice full of divine authority, he commanded, "Young man, I say to you, arise." Life returns. For a moment, there was silence. Then suddenly, a breath. The young man's chest rose, his fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered. A collective gasp swept through the crowd as the once dead man sat up. His eyes, confused at first, adjusted to the sunlight, and then he spoke. The pallbearers nearly dropped the beer in shock. People stepped back, their hands over their mouths, unable to believe what they had seen. Jesus, calm and unwavering, reached out his hand and helped the young man to his feet. Then, in an act of tender kindness, he turned and gave him back to his mother. The widow clutched her son in disbelief. Tears streamed down her face. This time, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming joy. She held him, sobbing, laughing, unable to find words. Fear and praise. The crowd stood frozen, staring at Jesus in awe. Then all at once, voices rose in wonder and fear. "A great prophet has risen among us," some shouted. "God has visited his people," others proclaimed. The news spread like wildfire. From Nain to the surrounding towns, to all of Judea, people spoke of the miracle. They told of the man who had command over life and death, the one who touched a lifeless body and brought it back to breath. And so, Jesus continued his journey, leaving behind a town forever changed, a mother no longer grieving, and a son who had been given a second chance at life. 7. The resurrection of Eutychus, Acts 20:7-12. It was a cool evening in the ancient city of Troas, and the believers gathered in an upper room to hear the Apostle Paul preach. The city was alive with the murmur of voices, the streets bustling with activity, but inside the house it was quiet, except for the sound of Paul's voice as he spoke to the faithful, exhorting them in the ways of the Lord. As the night stretched on, Paul continued to teach, the words flowing from his mouth with passion and conviction. His listeners, eager to hear the gospel, hung on his every word. The room was cramped, filled with men and women from all walks of life. The air was thick with warmth from the many lamps that burned through the night. Among those in the crowd was a young man named Eutychus. He sat in a windowsill, trying to find some relief from the heat and the crowded room. The evening had gone late, and as Paul spoke on, the young man's eyelids grew heavy. Eutychus fought to stay awake, but his exhaustion from the day, combined with the warmth of the room and the long hours of listening, made it nearly impossible. The gentle sway of the night air outside only added to his drowsiness. Finally, unable to keep his eyes open any longer, he slipped into a deep sleep. But in a tragic twist, as he slept, he began to lean further out of the window. His body, unaware of the danger, slid from the ledge, and before anyone could react, he fell to the ground, 3 stories below. A loud thud echoed in the night, followed by a piercing silence, a desperate rush. The people inside the room heard the crash and rushed to the window. They saw Eutychus lying motionless on the ground below, his body twisted in an unnatural way. Panic spread through the crowd as they ran down to where he lay. His body was limp, and there was no sign of life. His eyes were closed, and his chest did not rise. It was clear to everyone that Eutychus was dead. The believers were overwhelmed with grief. The young man, who had been listening so intently to the word of God, was now lifeless. His fall had come suddenly and tragically, and there was no hope left in the eyes of those who stood around him. But Paul was not dissuaded by the sight of death. He came down from the upper room where the others had gathered around the body. Paul's prayer and the miracle. Paul knelt beside Eutychus, his heart heavy with the sorrow of the situation. But his faith was unwavering. He reached down, covering the young man with his own body. "Do not be alarmed," Paul said to the crowd, his voice steady and full of confidence. His life is still in him. With that, Paul embraced the body of Eutychus, praying fervently. The room fell silent as all eyes focused on the apostle and the lifeless form in his arms. And then, something happened. The stillness of the night was broken by a gasp from Eutychus. His chest suddenly rose with a deep breath. His eyes fluttered open, blinking in confusion as he found himself cradled in the arms of Paul. His body was alive, no longer stiff and cold, but warm once more. A return to life. Eutychus sat up, bewildered by his sudden revival. The people around him stared, not believing what they were seeing. What had been a tragic accident, a certain death, had now turned into a miraculous moment, a sign of God's power over life and death. Paul, with a smile of assurance, helped Eutychus to his feet. "Don't be afraid," he said. "You're alive." The crowd was stunned, their hearts filled with awe and joy. They had just witnessed the incredible power of God. A young man, dead one moment and alive the next, restored to life by the apostles' prayers. After this miracle, Paul returned to the upper room, where they continued to break bread and teach. The believers were comforted and strengthened by the miracle they had witnessed. The death of Eutychus had been transformed into a testimony of God's grace and power. A vivid reminder that even in the darkest moments, God could bring light and life. The end of the night. The rest of the evening was filled with celebration and joy. The people in the room, now filled with hope, continued to listen as Paul spoke into the early hours of the morning. Eutychus, no longer weary, sat among them, alive, whole, and filled with gratitude. The believers in Troas would never forget the night when a young man fell to his death, but was brought back to life through the power of God. It was a moment of miraculous grace, a reminder that even when it seems like all hope is lost, God is able to bring life out of death. 8. The resurrection of Tabitha, Dorcas, Acts 9:10-36-42. The town of Joppa, nestled along the Mediterranean coast, was a thriving and bustling place. Its streets were filled with the sounds of merchants peddling their wares, the calls of fishermen returning from the sea, and the laughter of children playing by the shore. Among the residents of Joppa was a woman named Tabitha, known also by the Greek name Dorcas. Tabitha was beloved by all who knew her. She was a woman of great kindness and generosity, always helping the poor and the needy. Her hands were never idle. Whether she was sewing garments for the widows or tending to the sick, she poured out her life in service to others. But despite her many good deeds, Tabitha's health began to fail. She grew weaker with each passing day, and the inevitable came. The day arrived when Tabitha fell ill and died. Her friends and family were devastated. The community grieved deeply, for Tabitha had been a light in their lives. They washed her body and laid it in an upper room, preparing for her burial. A call for help. In the nearby town of Lydda, the Apostle Peter was staying with a man named Simon, a tanner by trade. When the news of Tabitha's death reached Joppa, the grieving disciples immediately sent for Peter. They had heard of the miracles Peter had performed, and they believed that God could use him to bring Tabitha back to life. 2 men were dispatched to find Peter. They hurried to him with urgency in their steps, calling out, "Please come at once." Peter did not hesitate. He rose and followed them immediately, his heart moved by the news. As they traveled, the disciples in Joppa, though sorrowful, held on to the hope that God might yet work a miracle for Tabitha. The arrival at the upper room. When Peter arrived at the house in Joppa, he was led to the upper room where Tabitha's body had been laid. The room was filled with weeping widows, each of them mourning the loss of the woman who had been so generous to them. They showed Peter the tunics and garments that Tabitha had made for them, her handiwork, a testament to her love and care. Peter's heart was deeply moved by the scene, but he did not let his emotions take over. He instructed everyone to leave the room, creating a space of quiet and solitude. Kneeling beside Tabitha's body, Peter prayed earnestly, his voice steady and full of faith. He knew that God could do the impossible, that the same power that had raised Jesus from the dead was still at work. After praying, Peter turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, arise." A miraculous revival. The room was silent for a moment. Then, to the astonishment of all, Tabitha's eyes fluttered open. She sat up, her face pale but alive, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she regained consciousness. Peter reached out his hand and helped her to her feet. It was as though she had been gently awakened from a deep sleep. The widows and friends who had gathered outside the room heard the commotion and rushed back in, their eyes wide in disbelief. And there, standing before them, was Tabitha, alive, well, and restored to them. The room erupted in praise and astonishment. The miracle was undeniable. The woman who had been dead was now living, and her resurrection was a sign of the power of God at work through Peter. The spread of the good news. The news of Tabitha's resurrection spread quickly throughout Joppa and the surrounding areas. People came from all over to see the woman who had returned from the dead, and many were drawn to the faith. Scripture tells us that many people believed in the Lord because of this miracle. Tabitha's resurrection was not just a testament to her kindness, but also a powerful witness to the life-giving power of Jesus Christ. Through Peter, God had shown once again that he had power over death and that he could bring life to even the most hopeless of situations. For the believers in Joppa, the miracle of Tabitha's return was a sign of God's ongoing work in the world. It was a reminder that death was not the end, that the Lord could bring new life where there seemed to be none. Tabitha's story would inspire and encourage many, her resurrection a beacon of hope to all who heard it. The true resurrection. All these people experienced the miraculous power of God. They saw the grave and returned from it. But in the end, they all died again, except for one. Jesus Christ rose from the dead, never to die again. His resurrection was different. It was eternal. And because of him, death no longer has the final say. With Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you too can beat death and have a part in the inheritance of eternal life. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? John 11:25-26. For those who believe, resurrection is not just a temporary return to life. It is an eternal victory, and they shall live and reign with Christ forever and ever. Thank you for watching. God bless you.
Thank you for watching. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe. Click on the notification bell so you can be alerted anytime a new video is uploaded. And please don't forget, share and be a blessing to someone. God richly bless you. Shalom.